Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Sawyer, and welcome to this program, which is a conjunction with our course this semester at Lincoln Center on U.S. immigration and ethnicity. We're very happy to have this guest speaker here today, Dr. Geraldo Cadava, who is professor of history and Wendell Lewis Teaching and Research Professor and director of the Latina and Latino Studies Program at Northwestern University. There he teaches courses on Latino history, the American West, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, migration to and from Latin America, as well as on subjects like Watergate, the musical Hamilton, and the 2016 and 2020 elections. He's an historian of the United States and Latin America, and he focuses on the history of Latinos in the United States and on U.S.-Mexico borderlands. His first book was Standing on Common Ground, The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland, which was published in 2013 by Harvard University Press. And he will speak today on the topic of his most recent book, The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, which was published by Echo HarperCollins in 2020. His other writings have appeared in the Journal of American History, the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and elsewhere. You can learn more about his public-facing writing and media appearances on his website, www.geraldocadava.com. He's speaking today courtesy of the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program, and today's lecture is sponsored by the Latin American and Latino Studies Institute at Fordham University, along with Fordham's History, Modern Languages and Literatures, Political Science, and Sociology and Anthropology departments in the American Studies program. So I will turn it over to Dr. Cadava.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Daniel, and thank you to everyone who made this event possible, including Fordham, of course, and the Latin American Latino Studies Institute and all of the other departmental and program and center co-sponsors at Fordham. And thank you for Daniel and Isaac for doing a lot of the legwork to put this together. And of course, thank you to the Organization of American Historians for, not only, having the Distinguished Lecturers Program, which I think is really great, and it helps historians do some good public-facing work and help us kind of get our work out there, but also to the Organization of American Historians generally for just supporting so much great work by historians of the broader international, transnational United States. I can say without a doubt that it's been the most important professional organization to me personally, and thank you for everything you guys do. So today, it's true, I am going to be talking about my book, The Hispanic Republican, right here. Here's a copy of it. Again, the hard copy came out 2 years ago, right before the 2020 election, maybe 5 or 6 months before. Was it that? No, not even that long, maybe 4 months before the 2020 election. And then the paperback came out in 2021. And I only bring up the difference between when the hard copy and paperback came out, because a lot happened between the time the hardback and paperback came out. And I had the chance right after the 2020 election to rewrite the introduction to take into consideration the outcome and results with Latinos in particular. So I am going to talk about the book. I think that it's also in some ways more interesting to talk about the broader issues that the book raises about Latino identity, Latino conservatism. Indeed, these have been some of the most interesting, to me at least, conversations to have come out of the 2020 election. And I think also this is just a really interesting time to be thinking about the role of Latinas and Latinos in the United States. And a lot of the broader national conversation about Latinas and Latinos, I think, has been shaped, at least very recently, by the results of the 2020 election. And I think that the election, in some ways, there was the result, there was the surprise that Donald Trump actually increased his support among Latinos between 2016 and 2020. In 2016, he won 28% of the Latino vote. And then in 2020, the initial reports, the exit polls said that he won 32% of the Latino vote. But all of the data that has come out since the initial exit polls, because exit polls are just kind of like snapshots on election eve, and then as precincts report, actual votes get counted, we get a much clearer picture of what the actual result was. And the more data that comes out, the stronger the result has been for Donald Trump. So in the spring, the Pew Hispanic Research Center released a finding that new estimates cited, or new estimates found that as many as, or as much as 38% of Latinos voted for Donald Trump, which is approaching the kind of historical records won by a Republican candidate. That's George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004, who won, 40 or 44% of the Latino vote in his two campaigns in 2000 and 2004. So, the results have gotten even better for Donald Trump in the months since the election. So what has been really interesting to me has been to see how that fact has kicked up a whole conversation about who Latinos are. Does it even make sense to think of Latinos as a people if a significant minority of Latinos could vote for a candidate like Donald Trump? And again, to me, the result wasn't surprising, and I'll talk about that for much of my time because I had just written a book about how over the past 50 years, a significant minority of Latinos had voted for Donald Trump. So the result wasn't surprising to me. It was in many ways predictable, but what was surprising is the conversation that has developed about who Latinos are as a people. What does Donald Trump's strong performance among Latinos even mean about us as a coherent, unified people? And what's interesting about that, again, as a Latino historian, is that, that's a kind of internal conversation that Latinos have been having for, centuries. Like, what brings us together as a people? Are we a people? What makes us similar? What makes us different? What is the basis of Latino identity? Anyway, these are conversations that we have been having with ourselves, with our family members for a long time, but it's been interesting to watch that conversation erupt as a kind of national discourse. And maybe that's not so surprising considering now there are 62 million Latinos living in the United States. So as Latinos represent a greater and greater share of the American population, maybe we would assume that this conversation about Latino identity is also a conversation about American identity, since we represent a greater and greater share of the population. So after the election, there have been several kind of milestones that have sparked national interest when it comes to Latinos and have only kind of played into that broader conversation about who Latinos are. I'm thinking about, of course, in the first days of the Biden administration, the kind of surge of migrants at the border that sparked a conversation, a kind of revisiting of the Trump years and whether Biden was going to make a radical departure from Trump when it came to border policy and immigration, with many people disappointed that it didn't seem like he was doing all that much different, especially by keeping Title 42 in place, which was a kind of emergency measure in the era of the pandemic to limit the flow of migrants. So people were disappointed that many people, like immigration advocates, were disappointed that Biden seemed to not be moving in a very different direction. Then there was the kind of controversy about Afro-Latino representation in Lin-Manuel Miranda's movie In the Heights, and how he didn't represent enough Afro-Latino lead characters in a neighborhood like Washington Heights, which in many ways has been built by Afro-Latinos. And that sparked a conversation about representation of Latinos and Latino identity. Then there were the census results, which found that a pretty dramatic shift took place between 2010 and 2020 with a really kind of significant shift, like a 500 percentage point increase in the number of or percentage of Latinos who identified as being mixed race or of one or two or more races defining their background and defining as other, and many Latinos defining themselves less as white alone and also less as Black alone. So that too, the fact that Latinos were increasingly identifying as other or of two or more races on the census, that sparked another national conversation about Latino identity. And then most recently, we paid a lot of attention to the California recall election and how Latinos voted either in support of the recall of Gavin Newsom or against the recall of Gavin Newsom. So all of this stuff is building toward 2022, building toward 2024, and everyone is trying to kind of read the tea leaves about what's going on with Latinos right now. And so for all of these reasons, I think the topic that we're discussing today is interesting and of national importance and critical, I think, to understanding who Latinos are and have been. So now I will start talking about the Hispanic Republican. I first kind of want to tell you just a little bit about how I came to the project and what sparked my interest. And I think the headline here is that it actually had very little to do with wanting to dive into Latino partisan politics. It had to do more with work I had done on my first book, Standing on Common Ground, and my relationship with my Republican grandfather. So in my first book, which is about the Arizona-Sonora border region since World War II, the main character probably in that whole book is a department store owner named Alex Jacome Jr. And he was a conservative Mexican-American business owner, good friends with the Republican Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. His closest associates were the kind of political and economic elite of Sonora, Mexico. And I was just kind of struck by this guy's history because I hadn't encountered anyone like him in an archive before. I mean, to the extent that Latino historians wrote anything about Latino conservatives, it was about the Cuban exile community in Miami. But we knew very little about Mexican-American conservatives. So I wanted to explore the kind of broader world of characters like Alex Jacome. And much to my surprise, when I really dug into my research, I found that it was actually Mexican-American Republicans from the Southwest, people like Jacome, who really built the Hispanic Republican movement in the 1950s and 1960s, before Cuban Americans became really politically active in South Florida. I had also, I've spent a lifetime arguing with my grandfather about politics. His name is Geraldo Cadava Jr. He is my namesake. I never understood why he's the junior, even though he is my grandfather. But he was born in Panama. His parents were from the Philippines and Colombia. He became a US citizen by joining the US Air Force after he had immigrated from Panama to San Francisco to San Diego, joined the Air Force, moved all around, including another stint, a tour in back in Panama. That's where my father was born. But then he retired in Tucson, Arizona. And after retiring from the military, he washed dishes at a country club in Arizona, the 49ers Country Club in Tucson. And he worked in silver mines outside of Tucson, Arizona, called Silver Bell is what the name of the mine was. And he told stories about having voted for Ronald Reagan for the first time in 1980. That was the first time he had ever voted for a Republican, because Reagan was promising to put more money back into his biweekly paychecks in the form of tax cuts. So that's why he chose to stop voting for Democrats, begin voting for Republicans. But in the 40 years since he first voted for a Republican, he has come to embrace kind of every position of the Republican Party when it comes to welfare, border policy, taxes, foreign relations, just everything. So I was really interested in, the political transformation of this one individual who voted for a Republican in 1980 for a very specific reason, but then came to embrace all of the positions of the Republican Party, and how his own kind of political transformation was representative of the development of a real kind of loyalty to the Republican Party by Latinos. And as the Republican Party changed too, between the 1950s and the early 21st century, it didn't really matter how the Republican Party changed. Latino Republicans had developed a loyalty to the Republican Party, to the extent that my grandfather, when I asked him in 2016 how he felt about Donald Trump, said that, of course, he loves Donald Trump because he is a Republican. It didn't matter what policies were or what Donald Trump did and did not stand for. Donald Trump was a good guy because he was a Republican, which to me suggested the development of a kind of loyalty to the Republican Party that was didn't pay much regard to or much attention to what the Republican Party actually stood for. So I think, Alex Jacome, this character in my first book, and then my longtime arguments with my grandfather about Latino conservatism, that's why I wanted to understand this broader world of Latino Republicans. It had little to do with wanting to have my book come out just a few months before the election to explain this phenomenon that was increasingly important in American politics. It had to do with reasons related to my family and other work I had done before. I suspect that that's probably typical of many of us who immerse ourselves in years-long research projects, that there's some sort of personal connection rather than just wanting to, partake in some broader public conversation. That said, of course, it's you spend years researching and writing books, and of course it's gratifying. I don't know if that's the right word, but it is nice to have something that you've thought a lot about being discussed nationally, just because you've dedicated years of your life to doing something. So you think the topic is important, and it's of course interesting and gratifying when you learn that other people think that the topic is important as well. Okay, that's how I came to the book. I want to spend 20 minutes or so just talking to you about the book, what some of my findings are, and then maybe at 3:40 or so, I will stop and we can have a conversation. And I'm, always more interested in that part of the event anyway, because it's always nice to hear from you guys. So be thinking of your questions. So, the book itself traces the history of the Hispanic Republican movement from about the early 1950s into the present. And the book is divided into 4 sections that I think more or less follows the arc of the Hispanic Republican movement as it has evolved since the 1950s. And those 4 parts, the first is called Awakening. The second is called Inclusion. The third is called Doubt. And the fourth is called Loyalty. And I will explain a little more about what each of those things means. Awakening is just the kind of these early nascent and incipient moments when a national movement has not yet come together, but particular Latino groups in particular places have come together to back a particular candidate at the same time that the Republican Party increases its investments in recruiting Latino voters and comes to believe that it is increasingly important to recruit Latino voters. The period of inclusion is about, the 1970s, really. I mean, Richard Nixon in 1972 really increased his performance among Latinos. I'll say more about that, but he really kind of set the standard for the next 50 years. And ever since Richard Nixon's reelection in 1972, somewhere between a quarter and a third of Latinos have voted for the Republican presidential candidate. Sometimes it's been a little less, like with Gerald Ford and Bob Dole. Sometimes it's been a little more, like with George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump, surprisingly. So Donald Trump in 2020, not 2016, that is. So Richard Nixon is the person who kind of set that bar for Republicans following him. And then after 1972, kind of other Republican candidates wanted to duplicate his success. I'll say more about how Richard Nixon was successful in just a little bit. The 1980s, beginning with Reagan, kind of going until the end of George H.W. Bush's period. This is a period that I think of in terms of doubt, which means that, yes, Latino Republicans simultaneously see themselves as more included within the Republican Party apparatus. They have more appointees. There are more Latino Republicans running for office. They have representation from auxiliary groups that are affiliated with the Republican Party. But at the same time, they doubt whether they are truly being included, whether they are kind of tokens or whether they really have a seat at the table of decision-making within the Republican Party. And there are all these kind of nativist movements creeping up in the 1980s that Latino Republicans are very uncomfortable with. So it's a moment of doubt. And then finally, since 1992, I see this as a period of loyalty, because it's a period when the Republican Party is moving far to the right on border policy and immigration policy, yet its performance among Latino Republicans isn't affected all that much. I mean, Bob Dole in 1996 doesn't do particularly well, but you can chalk that up, I think, to the particularities of his candidacy, and the Republican Party then rebounds with George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004. And I think that we're still more or less in this moment of Hispanic Republican loyalty to the Republican Party, even if they don't agree with every position of the party and don't even love the direction that the party is going in. They still exhibit some loyalty. So now I'll dig into those different periods just a little more. So, you know, the first president to really launch a Hispanic outreach campaign as a Republican was Dwight Eisenhower. And there were Latinos con Eisenhower, Me Gusta Ike movements across the Southwest in particular. And what drew Latinos to a figure like Dwight Eisenhower? It was the fact that he was the general who helped us win World War II, and many Latinos who were veterans of the war themselves felt like Eisenhower was the one who could best lead the United States during the Cold War. So groups in Texas, California started rallying around Dwight Eisenhower. At the same time, the Republican Party recognized the importance of the American West and Western states as the West really exploded after World War II with the growth of the Sun Belt and all of these things many of us are familiar with, you know, from classes on 20th century American history or the history of the American West. But the West became an increasingly important region. The whole Sun Belt, stretching from Florida to California, became increasingly important in the world of electoral politics because of the growth of the Sun Belt. It also is the case that the greatest number of Latinos in the United States lived in the Sun Belt from Florida to California. So to provide a concrete example, in 1950, New York State was still the state with the greatest number of electoral votes. I think it was like 32 or 34. But between 1950 and 1960, that shifted, and states like Texas and California and Florida, where many Mexican Americans and Cuban communities lived, from the late 1950s forward became increasingly important politically. So that's when both parties actually kind of made an increased effort to reach out to Latino voters in the Southeast and Southwest. But it's important to note that these were kind of incipient movements. This was not Latino groups across the country weren't really working together. Yes, there were isolated kind of Latinos con Eisenhower movements or organizations across the country, but it hadn't coalesced as a movement. That kind of incipient, insurgent or growing or nascent character of the Hispanic Republican movement continued through much of the 1960s, and with a character like Barry Goldwater. And one important thing to note is that the Republican Party after World War II has a string of Western candidates like Barry Goldwater, like Richard Nixon, like Ronald Reagan. All of those kinds of characters felt like they had a natural connection with the Mexican American community in particular because of where they had grown up. I mean, Barry Goldwater talked about having learned Spanish when he was a child at the same time that he learned English. And he also talks about how he basically grew up on the border. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration. Tucson is 60 miles north of the border, and Barry Goldwater did not spend most of his time in a border community, much like Richard Nixon later, when he talked about having grown up in the agricultural fields of Southern California and like Whittier and Yorba Linda, just southeast of Los Angeles. He didn't actually work alongside Mexican Americans, but he claimed to know them. He knew them because he had grown up around them. And this was really the pitch they made. It's also important to note that by the by the early 1960s, really, Latino Republicans who were moving toward the Republican Party, they were trying to figure out how they were going to convince Latino Democrats to convert to becoming Republicans. And their argument was that, look, Latinos have been loyal to the Democratic Party ever since the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that during the New Deal, he had helped them put food on the table, find jobs, and they developed a kind of blind loyalty to the Democratic Party because of Roosevelt. But Latino conservatives in the 1950s and 60s started asking other Latinos who had traditionally voted Democrats, well, what have you gotten for your loyalty to the Democratic Party? Has it made you any better off? I mean, the Democratic Party comes around every 4 years looking for your votes, but then in between elections ignores you. And so I think you can still hear echoes of that kind of logic today, that the Democratic Party takes Latino votes for granted, but they don't actually go and listen to Latinos about what it is that they want. I mean, whether you like that argument or not, this is the argument that Latino Republicans have used over a long period of time in order to try to recruit Latino voters. So Barry Goldwater, as we know from other contexts of American history in the 20th century, did not do well in his election against Lyndon Johnson. He got creamed, you might even say. And he didn't do especially well among Latinos either, even though he had tried to reach out to Mexican Americans in the Southwest. And he also tried to reach out to kind of new Cuban communities in the Southeast. Because remember, Castro's revolution was in 1959, Barry Goldwater ran in 1964. In between the Cuban Revolution and Barry Goldwater's candidacy, important things happened, like the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so a lot of Goldwater's campaign actually was based on this idea about how John F. Kennedy had really mucked things up with Cuba and had really betrayed Cuban exiles in Miami at the Bay of Pigs because he never sent the military backup that he had promised them. And so you'll still hear Cubans today talking about JFK's betrayal of them at the Bay of Pigs as a really important part of the explanation for why Cubans became loyal Republicans. But the fact of the matter is, in 1964, Cubans weren't a really important factor in American politics because most exiles even had not naturalized and become American citizens who could vote. They weren't really invested in American politics because they were still thinking in the early 1960s about how they were going to overthrow Castro and return triumphantly to Cuba. And so therefore they were more invested in Cuban politics than they were in American politics. So that's why these movements, I mean, they're still kind of isolated movements, right? In the Southwest and Florida, they haven't come together. Richard Nixon in his first 4 years really changed things. Something important was going on in the late 1960s within the Republican Party that necessitated Richard Nixon going out and finding more votes. And that is most particularly that African Americans were leaving the Republican Party in droves in the late 1960s because of the Republican Party's failures to support the Civil Rights Act proposed and passed by Lyndon Johnson. I mean, Barry Goldwater, their candidate in '64, was opposed to Johnson's Civil Rights Act. So African Americans, even though they had, a great number of them had been Republicans at least since the Civil War, because of Lincoln, the great emancipator, right? This legacy of the Republican Party really still resonated with African American voters until the Republican Party's transformation in the mid-1960s. So it was very explicit that Republican strategists wrote to Nixon during his first administration to say that we need to find more support to make up for the fact that African Americans are leaving the Republican Party. And Latinos became one of the main targets for the Republican Party. So what did Nixon do to increase his support among Latinos? He appointed the first Hispanic treasurer of the United States, a woman named Romana Acosta Bañuelos. And so throughout the 1970s, much of the 1970s, a Mexican-American Republican woman's signature was on all of the dollar bills in the United States, all of the American currency printed in the 1970s. That's largely a symbolic gesture. I mean, the treasurer of the United States, as opposed to the Secretary of the Treasury, does not set policy or anything like that. They oversee the mint, they sign the dollar bills, things like that. But it was the symbolic importance is significant because what Romana Acosta Bañuelos was supposed to represent was that Latinos were included within this presidential administration. Nixon thought that it was important to include Latinos. And the symbolism of someone like Romana Acosta Bañuelos is also important because, 1972, this is the middle of these civil rights movements and the Chicano movement. So Nixon, as a Republican, he argued that economic uplift was almost like the third plank of his civil rights movement that didn't get as much attention as the social and political movements that were all over the TV in places like Selma or Watts, California. But economic uplift was every bit as important to progress for Latino and African American communities. So Bañuelos, as a woman who started her own tortilla company, Ramona's Mexican Food Products, which still exists today and is one of the largest Mexican food distributors in the Southwest, a business owner, someone who had opened a bank, the Pan American National Bank, which closed, but had been a largely Mexican-American serving bank in East LA at a time when larger banks like Wells Fargo wouldn't offer loans to Mexican Americans. The Pan American National Bank, founded by Romana Acosta Bañuelos, would. Most importantly to Nixon was the fact that she was a woman who proved that women could get ahead in business. She actually didn't have children. She started fellowships for Mexican American students at UCLA who had an interest in business, and she was decidedly not a Chicano. She was not part of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s. She believed, like Nixon believed, and like many Republicans believed, that uplift happened through economic mobility. And so Nixon also did things like he created the National Economic Development Agency, which helped Latino business owners open banks, savings and thrift banks. He appointed a guy named Philip Sanchez to head up the Office of Minority Business Enterprise. He also formed the Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-speaking people, which was kind of an interagency committee that, along with the heads of various agencies, government agencies like labor and agriculture, all of the heads of the agencies that most worked with Latinos were part of this interagency cabinet committee on opportunities for Spanish-speaking people. Nixon also, for the first time, included Hispanics. I know this is a controversial term, but for the first time included Hispanics on the census, on the US Census. And so the idea was that counting Latinos was a really important way of helping to create opportunities for them, because in order to know how many Latinos should be given government jobs, they needed to know how many Latinos there were in particular areas in order to make sure that they had federal jobs available to them. And in fact, some Latino conservatives didn't like this about Nixon, because the effort to set aside a certain percentage of federal government jobs to Latinos or African Americans in particular regions based on their percentage of the population, in the minds of many conservatives, amounted to quotas. So some Latino conservatives who didn't like Nixon but then loved Reagan, they didn't like Nixon because they thought of Nixon as the father of the quota system. Nevertheless, there was this idea that Nixon had actually done quite a lot for Latinos, and as a result, he increased his support among Latinos from something like 8% in 1968 to 33 or 35% in 1972. And so that's a pretty dramatic increase. And again, as I said earlier, it kind of set the bar for all Republicans after him. So because he had done so much better than other Republicans, than any other Republican before him, you know, throughout the 1970s, Gerald Ford and even Ronald Reagan in 1980 tried to duplicate his success. And so, you know, the Republican National Committee, which was headed by George H.W. Bush in 1974, helped establish the Spanish Speakers Auxiliary to the RNC. They helped establish the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, which has had a bit of a revival lately. It's kind of, for a while in the 70s and 80s, it was a kind of powerhouse. It was almost like a bullpen for Republican administration appointees. There was a guy who was the head of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly in the 1970s named Benjamin Fernandez, who became the first Hispanic to ever run for president in 1980. And he had been the head of the RNHA, and his whole theory about his case, he ran in the primaries against Ronald Reagan, against George H.W. Bush, against Howard Baker. He got crushed, obviously, but his whole theory of the case was that the country actually needed a Latino president and an economist, which he was in 1980, because of Jimmy Carter's disastrous economic policies, because of the fact that he was soft on communism. So Fernandez's theory of the case was that the country actually needed a Hispanic economist who could speak Spanish and develop relationships with Latin American countries, and someone who could be a better steward of the economy than Jimmy Carter had been. So again, this was like a moment when Latinos felt themselves to be included within the Republican Party's apparatus. There had been auxiliary groups that had formed to represent Latinos nationally. The other thing the Republican National Hispanic Assembly did was it brought together conservative groups across the country. You know, the way they organized the assembly in general is that there was a national Republican, National Hispanic Assembly, then there were state chapters and even local chapters that mirrored congressional districts. And all of those, so there was a kind of vertical structure that put Latino Republicans across the country in communication with one another. So this was a moment of promise for Latino Republicans, and they felt like they had momentum. They thought Reagan was a great candidate as well. You know, and he's interesting. Reagan's interesting, right? I mean, he was a kind of very ideologically conservative right-winger. He was a staunch anti-communist, and he is the one that Mexican-American Republicans say really brought Cubans into the Hispanic Republican movement. Reagan was good friends with Jorge Mascanosa, who was the head of the Cuban American National Foundation, one of these leading organizations that represented the Cuban exile community. He had also been the governor of California and claimed to have appointed more Hispanics to his governmental administration than any California governor since the 19th century. He also, in his conversations with the Mexican president, Jose Lopez Portillo, said that we didn't need a border wall between the United States and Mexico. Mexico was our most important ally. He also famously signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986. It was the last kind of grand compromise on immigration that we've had into the present. So it included a combination of employer sanctions, which were penalties on employers for knowingly hiring undocumented immigrants. It included a path to citizenship, naturalization. It's called amnesty at the time. I think maybe we still use amnesty, although Democrats like to call it more a path to citizenship. So Reagan had forged this grand compromise in a way that kind of angered many Republicans who were arguing that to give undocumented Mexican immigrants a path to citizenship was akin to rewarding them for illegal activity. So there was a lot that Latino Republicans liked about Reagan, but at the same time, beginning the late 1970s, groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, this is a kind of nativist organization that really sought to limit the population growth of the United States. But their leader, John Tanton, was actually, acknowledged being influenced by the eugenicist thinking of the late 19th and early 20th century. A spin-off group of the Federation for American Immigration Reform was U.S. English, which was a group that tried to pass a constitutional amendment to make English the official language of the United States. And many Hispanic Republicans did not like that either. So that's why I call this period of the 1980s a moment of doubt. Man, I see myself running short on time. Somehow I think I'm going to be able to wrap it all up in 30, 40 minutes, but we're professors. So you put a nickel in us and we just go on and on and on. So here I am at 3:45, still needing to talk about the final section of loyalty. So I'm going to try to breeze through that very quickly. And I can do so by saying, and I'm skipping over the George H.W. Bush years in order to do so, but it's really interesting because it kind of highlights this fissure that's growing within the Republican Party at the time, because in 1992, George H.W. Bush has a very serious primary challenge from Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan, the kind of right-wing ideologue, I can say more about him. For now, I'll just dismiss him as a right-wing ideologue. He won something like 37% of all primary votes in 1972, which meant that George H.W. Bush, in order to win over Buchanan's supporters in the general election against both Bill Clinton and Ross Perot, he had to bow to some of Pat Buchanan's demands that got included in the Republican Party platform in 1992, including the construction of a border wall, which caused a huge stir at the Republican convention. But to wrap up with this loyalty period, the 1990s is really the moment when the Republican Party quickly moves to the right on immigration. It happens in states like California with the passage of Proposition 187. After Proposition 187, and I can say more about Prop 187 if you guys have questions about it during our discussion. But after Prop 187, a lot of states want to mimic Prop 187 and have their own restrictive bill. Prop 187 actually goes on to influence Newt Gingrich's Republican-led Congress between 1994 and 1996 and leads to the passage of a pretty restrictive immigration bill. It wasn't a grand compromise like IRCA was, the Immigration Reform and Control Act signed by Reagan, but in 1996, there was a restrictive bill called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. That's a mouthful, but Bill Clinton signed it largely due to pressure from Republican congressmen in the 1990s. But it included things like taking away social benefits from legal refugees and also importantly, the 287G provision, which made it possible for local police authorities to cooperate with the US Border Patrol to detain immigrants because immigration had largely been a federal responsibility beforehand. So that's the beginning of this period that I think we're still living in, where the Republican Party takes pretty hardline stances on immigration. And I think in that context, George W. Bush, who did pretty well among Hispanics in 2000 and 2004, is a kind of blip on the radar screen, an 8-year exception to this longer 30-year period of rightward movement on immigration and border controls that in many ways has defined the Republican Party of the past 30 years. So I think we're still in this period of loyalty. The wrinkle here is that we need to spend a lot of time thinking about how exactly it was that Donald Trump not only maintained Latino support, but also grew Latino support, because it suggests something more than loyalty. It allows for the possibility that there actually could be a kind of red wave cresting that is pushing more and more, not only Latinos, but we saw it with Asian Americans and African Americans as well, even if on a more minor scale, of a movement toward the Republican Party. And that's more than just loyalty. That means that there's something else going on. And so, I imagine that if I were finishing this book right now, looking ahead to 2024, I might have a different kind of ending point than what I'm saying about loyalty. But I think I've mapped out the arc of the book, introduced you to some of the characters, presented some of the history, and I think I'll stop now and hear some of your questions because I know that it's a lot to digest and you might have other concerns on your mind, other topics and questions on your mind besides just the history. So I'd love to hear from you. So I'll zip my lip until you have questions.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So let me first ask if there's anyone in the classroom that wants to ask a question. So Shannon, why don't you come up so that he can see you and hear you?
That would be great.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned Proposition 187, and I'm from California, so I hear all the time people complaining about various propositions, mostly my parents.
Yes. Probably having to do with taxes and
oh my God, all the time. Don't even get me started on my own grandfather. Man has opinions and doesn't want them to be heard, but wants them to be heard anyway.
I know.
So you mentioned Prop 187, which I remember that it would almost put in the profiling aspect of it, that there's really no way to enact it without almost like a stop and frisk based type profiling based on like features and heritage and stuff like that. With I'm not sure the word for it, but like advances in stopping that kind of racial profiling, all other problems with that proposition aside, are more bills and propositions like that being enacted? Is that something that's continued to be popular?
Oh yeah.
the state, like the, that at a high level of it, not just like a New York style stop and frisk. I know people always argue about either bringing that back or the terribleness.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Proposition 187 at the time in California in the 1990s and then in the nation in general had a lot of admirers. And, Pete Wilson, who was the governor of California, who really championed, he really kind of retooled his whole re-election campaign as governor around Proposition 187. And after he was reelected and after the passage of Proposition 187, he was really considered to be one of the leading candidates to become the Republican nominee for president. So he was wildly popular, and then several states debated and also passed versions of Proposition 187. That was in the mid-1990s, 1994, 1995. Things cooled down a little bit with the election of George W. Bush, because the Republican Party in many ways sighed in relief when George W. Bush became the nominee, because they thought that he represented a kind of step back from the brink of Republican Party insanity in the 1990s, in part because he was promising to, really work with his counterpart Vicente Fox to forge a kind of more humane, compassionate immigration bill, all of these things. But the way the story gets told, all of that ended with 9/11. The way Vicente Fox tells the story, the former president of Mexico, good friends with George W. Bush, is that he was at the White House the week before September 11th, working on an immigration bill. Then 9/11 happened, and it ended any possibility of compromise on immigration. And it's after 9/11 when, yes, Muslims become, or alleged terrorists become the reason for enacting harsh border controls, because people like the governor of Texas, Rick Perry, are saying that jihadists are carrying missiles through the desert across the border. That becomes the reason for passing harsh immigration and border restrictions like the Secure Fence Act in 2006 and 2007. So after 9/11, you see the rise in popularity of new and in some ways even harsher immigration and border restrictions than Proposition 187. Because Proposition 187, what it proposed to do was to strip undocumented immigrants of the right to access to public education, public health care, and other social benefits. So it actually didn't do the thing you were saying, which is the stop and frisk kind of thing. That came in 2010 with Arizona's Senate Bill 1070. That was the so-called show me your papers law, where police officers not only had the option to, but were required to verify the immigration status of people they suspected of being in the states illegally. And so, I think SB 1070, and then after SB 1070, there were similar bills proposed in Alabama, Indiana, and Kansas, and a dozen other states. So, I think in many ways, the past 10, 20 years have seen an uptick in bills like Proposition 187 at the state level that are even harsher than Proposition 187.
Cool, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Anyone else in the room? So if people want to ask questions, I suggest that they put them in the Q&A function. You can see that at the bottom of your screen if anyone at home wants to do that. You can type out the questions in the Q&A and then we'll ask them out loud. In the meantime, I have a couple questions. So you talked about your grandfather as an example of someone who was attracted initially to the Republican Party for kind of material reasons, right? He thought the tax cuts were helpful to him. And you also talked about Nixon's appeal in that way too, in terms of uplift through business. So that brings two kind of different questions to my mind. One is simply, why is that more appealing than, after all, the FDR New Deal social democratic kind of model, which was also designed to do that, but through a different kind of way. So why is that more appealing to some people? And the other is, since you said your grandfather is attracted by that at first, but then he kind of gradually adopts all the other positions and of the Republican Party. And I would say by the, in the end of the 1990s, and to some extent still today, a lot of those are kind of cultural, kind of conservatism. You mentioned English only, and you mentioned Patrick Cannon and things like this. So what role do, comparatively, do these material considerations play compared to kind of cultural considerations? And I'm thinking also of Latino Catholics and evangelicals and people like that.
Yeah, totally. It's hard to disaggregate a lot of these things. And I'll give you a concrete example how, over the past year, there has been a lot of talk about how Democrats should respond to this charge of socialism. And, that is a tactic that, maybe it's disinformation, maybe it's a longer used tactic that Republicans have used for a long time to kind of smear Democrats. I mean, remember, Barack Obama was a socialist in 2011. It's not the first time we've been talking about that. And I've been thinking about this, and the thing with socialism is like it's shorthand for a lot of things that Latino Republicans care about. So of course, for people like, and this is what I mean by the kind of interplay between material concerns and these cultural concerns. So for sure, socialism as an idea, as a boogeyman, resonates with Venezuelans and Cubans, for sure. But I think all Latino groups also have a version of anti-socialism. The Mexicans, whose families came in the 1920s as part of the Cristero Wars in Mexico, they have an argument about how the 1917 Constitution was a Marxist-inspired document because it promised land redistribution and taking properties from large American-owned companies, things like that. So it was also a document that stripped the power of the church in public life in Mexico. So Mexicans have their own version of anti-socialism. Puerto Ricans have their own version of anti-socialism because it was characters like Pedro Albizu Campos, or these kind of radical Puerto Rican nationalists, or Lolita Lebron, who went and shot up Congress in 1954. These were kind of pro-independence activists and pro-statehoods activists. And the statehood movement in Puerto Rico, this is the movement that supports Puerto Rico becoming a state. It's been a Republican supported issue for a long time until very recently. So Puerto Ricans have their own version of anti-socialism. So my point is that what socialism means to Latin Americans, yes, it and Latinos, yes, it has to do with like these boogeymen like Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez and even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I heard Ted Cruz give a speech in 2019 where he, in the same breath, like drew a straight line between Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as representative of all of the same thing. And there's that part of the socialism charge, but socialism is also about the role of government in American life. It's also about religion and the ability to kind of teach religion in public schools or something like that. So socialism comes to stand in for so many things that are both about material realities, but also cultural issues. And so I think that's part of an answer too to why for Hispanic Republicans, it's not the New Deal model, which represents to them like interventions by the government or whatever. And they believe in this kind of model of free enterprise and anti-communism that is tied to support for capitalism. I think so that we can get to other questions, I'll stop there. But there's so many other interesting stories that, well, I can't resist telling one. So one Republican I interviewed, he told me that the problem with Democrats is that we're all just obsessed with race and obsessed with this idea that immigration is the only thing that Latinos care about. And his point is that Democrats totally misunderstand the ambitions of Latin American immigrants. They want to come to the United States not to be lumped in together with other Latinos as part of an American minority group, but in order to get ahead and support their families and things like that. So they think that they according to this guy, he loves it when Democrats kind of double down on the immigration stuff and the stuff about racial politics, because it's just a disconnect with Latin American immigrants. And, I think that's not exactly related to your question, but I think it has to do with the ways in which Republicans feel like Democrats are misunderstanding Latinos.
So to follow up on the second part of my question, which is kind of cultural conservatism among some Catholics and evangelical Protestants among them.
Yep. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to say a little more about that. I mean, it's really important. I think, Donald Trump, what we heard over the past, during the 4 years that he was in office, we heard all of his statements about immigrants and all of the bad stuff. But the truth is, he was, whether you like it or not, he was, it's almost like a split screen reality. It's like his statements about denigrating immigrants and all of that, at the same time that from the time he set foot in office, he made a real effort to recruit Latino Republicans. You probably don't remember this, but and I'm talking to everyone, not just you, Daniel, but in 2016 or 15, shortly after he declared himself a candidate, he said that he was going to win the Latino vote. He believed he was going to win the Latino vote. He did not, but he said he was going to win the Latino vote. And then a version of that for African Americans in Detroit, when he gave a speech, he said, what do you have to lose? Vote for me. What do you have to lose? So he thought from the very beginning that he was going to do well among non-white voters. And so from the moment he set foot in office, the two kind of groups he reached out to were Latino business owners, and he would give speeches at all of the big business gatherings and talk about things like his tax cuts. He talked about financial deregulations and made some claim that his administration decided that for every financial regulation that got passed, they would slash two. So it was an economic argument. But the other group that he really tried to make inroads with from the very beginning were Latino evangelicals in particular. Why did he do this? Not because he himself is an evangelical, of course, but for two reasons, I think. One is that among Latinos, evangelicalism is the fastest growing religion. It's true that half of Latinos today still identify as Catholic, and it's still the single largest religion, but the fastest growing religion is evangelicalism. That's one thing. The other thing is, it's not that evangelicals are by definition conservative. They're actually, like, evangelical leaders talk about evangelicals as the classic swing voters, that half vote for Democrats, half vote for Republicans. And in fact, the polling showed after 2020 that 46% of evangelicals supported Biden, 48% of evangelicals supported Trump. So Trump won the evangelical vote, but by a very narrow margin. And the point, I think, is that, it reminds me of Barry Goldwater's statement about you hunt where the ducks are. The fact that evangelicals are a 50-50 split, that's better odds for Republicans than among the population in general, the Latino population in general. So that's one reason to target evangelicals. The second is that evangelicalism is largely an immigrant religion. I mean, many Latin American immigrants in Latin America are evangelicals, and their first points of contact in the United States are evangelical churches. And so, the Republican Party is not oblivious to the fact that they need to make inroads with Latinos. And, there's so much talk about demography is destiny and what happens with demographic change. Republicans know that. They hear it. They know that they have to make inroads. And so I remember talking to the head of the Republican Party in El Paso, and he was telling me that he personally shows up at every single naturalization ceremony. This changed during COVID, but he showed up at every naturalization ceremony and handed out pamphlets to the newly sworn in citizens of the United States, telling them what the Republican Party stood for. So I don't think we appreciate sufficiently that the Republican Party also is trying to make inroads, even with immigrants, because they see the writing on the wall just like everyone else does. They know they need to find new voters. So I think one of the fundamental mistakes Democrats make is like, we just talk about how if we could only spend more time and more money recruiting Latinos earlier, they're just there, ready for the taking. And it's almost like 2 weeks before the Super Bowl, only covering and reporting on what one team is doing to prepare, and ignoring the fact that the other team also has a strategy to combat your strategy. And so, I think we need to realize that, and kind of go into it thinking that there's a war of persuasion to be won,
So you may have a ways to answer this. We had a question, which was why did Trump increase his vote in 2020? So he got a certain amount of loyalty, 2016, but why did he get more votes? And why does this surprise so many people?
Look, I am merely a historian at Northwestern University, and people like
that means you should know.
That means I should know. But there are like this is the kind of question that the leading pollsters in the country, people like Carlos Odio at Equis Research in Miami, and Matt Barreto and Gary Segura, formerly of Latino Decisions, they started a new company. These are the kinds of things that they not fret over, but pore over and think about why, what's behind it. Okay, so there are a lot of answers. And this is the big question. None of us, if you tell me that you do know the answer to this, I will say you're not telling the truth, because you couldn't possibly know. We don't know if 2020 was an anomaly or representative of something. We can't know that right now, because 2020 was in so many ways an incredibly unique political moment, in the sense that Donald Trump is a kind of unique political figure. I know there are lots of arguments about how unique he is, how representative he is. Yes, he represents a particular strain of the Republican Party that has existed for a long time, but his kind of dogmatism, his charisma, his background as a media personality, all of these things make him unique. I don't know. Historians hate using the word unique. I don't know if he's unique, but a special character. At the same time, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I can't tell you, in these halls of Harris Hall, where the history department is, we talk all the time about how if there had been no coronavirus, it's likely that Donald Trump would be in his second term right now. And so we don't know if 2020 was an anomaly or if it is truly representative of something happening. And that's what makes this question about what happened in 2020 so difficult to answer, because, Trump in some ways, very cynically, after George Floyd's murder, ramped up this kind of divisive tactic of culture wars, right? This is when there was a lot of talk, all the talk about socialism ramped up. Because I can tell you, from having interviewed so many Hispanic Republicans before COVID, they all felt super confident that Trump was going to do even better in 2020 than in 2016, because look how well the economy was doing. Home ownership among Latinos was higher than it's ever been. Family median incomes among Latinos were higher than they'd ever been. Latinas themselves were the fastest growing group of business owners. Whether Trump can rightfully take credit for this or not, he tried to take credit for it in the same way that all politicians try to take credit for something that's going well right now. So they thought that because of the economic argument that they were going to do really well. That was the idea going into COVID. I think COVID stripped from them, it took that card from them. It did, because for Latinos, 86% of Latino business owners reported having been affected by COVID, either having to lay off employees, shut their businesses. We know that Latinos were disproportionately impacted. We know that they contracted the virus. They were frontline workers, whatever. We know how COVID affected Latinos. And so I think what happened then, that's when the Trump administration, not just him, but Hispanics for Trump and all of his advisors, decided that that's when it needed to become a kind of culture war. And that's what happened. And so, I think Republican Hispanics will tell you that the reason Trump did better in 2020 is that Democrats have gone off the rails. We've moved too far to the left. We have, embraced the radical politics of the squad. It's not that Joe Biden himself is a socialist, but he is beholden. They've called him a Trojan horse because people he's in the pocket basically of people like AOC and Ilhan Omar and the squad, So many Hispanic Republicans will say that it's actually because of how the Democratic Party has moved that they have increasingly moved toward the Republican Party. I don't know that that's true. I'm not convinced, something Daniel Garza told me is that, part of why Trump did better is that Democrats just don't connect with the kind of cultural conservatives in rural Texas. And that's part of what explains the Rio Grande Valley. Maybe, I don't know, I don't know. In the months leading up to the election, there was a lot of attention to Trump's appeal among Latino men, that he had this kind of masculine appeal because of machismo or because of Latino men were overrepresented in industries like the Border Patrol or construction industries or policing that were male dominated and that gravitated towards Republicans. Maybe, but in the months after the election, Carlos Odio and Equis Research reported that the kind of greatest shift among Latinos actually took place among women, Latina business owners, that they moved more towards Trump than men did. So I don't know. I don't know. And that's why I think, you're going to hear a lot. And I'm just telling you guys, everyone who's still listening, you're going to hear a lot about, I take the California recall as an example. Democratic opinion writers wrote that California is, how Gavin Newsom did in the recall, pointed the way for Democratic successes among Latinos. Other people said that the California recall was a kind of canary in the coal mine for Democrats. The fact is, if you look at 2020 in California, the same exact percentage of Latinos who voted for Donald Trump supported the recall of Gavin Newsom. The same percentage of Latinos who supported Joe Biden opposed the recall. So there actually hasn't been any shift since November 2020. It's remarkably static, but you still see both sides kind of claiming victory right now, and that Democrats are saying 2020 was an anomaly. Latinos are coming home. Republicans are saying that this is representative of the growing conservatism of Latinos. I understand why Democratic strategists and Republican strategists need to say that right now, but you should not listen to them until 2022, until 2024. We need more time to figure out exactly what's going on. And I think if I can give a little plug for history and social science, this is where researchers come in. I mean, we're presented with these questions. We're presented with questions about the fact of the shift in 2020. We are presented with the fact of the shift in the census of how Latinos identify, but now we need to kind of dig in and figure out exactly what's going on, and that might take some time.
So we have time for maybe 1 minute answer to complicated question, which is, you asked at the beginning, who are Latinos? Who are Latinos as a people, and can they be said to be such if they are so divided on politics? But so is there an answer to that question?
No, but here's what I have to say. There is not an answer to that, but I am not discomforted by the fact that there is not an answer to that, because I mean, I was just listening, The Atlantic today hosted a kind of online streaming forum, one of their panels focused on this question of Latino identity, and people get all worked up about, are Latinos a people, are Latinos not a people? What I think is that the very essence of Latinidad, what it means to be Latino, is the ongoing argument about what it means to be Latino. And that's it. It's, you know, and we're constantly trying to negotiate the relationship between individual identity, group identity. We're always resisting being, in the same way that many of us are, like, you know, identity is complicated. So I don't think there's an answer about, are Latinos people, are we not a people? But I think that what it means to be Latino is the ongoing conversation. What I will say, and maybe I have 10 seconds left, maybe I don't, but you know, as the population of Latinos grows, today we're 19% of the population, 62 million Latinos, that's projected to grow. I think it, you know, in the same way that it would be hard to think of any group of 60 million people as a cohesive group, I think it will become harder and harder to do that. And we'll have to think of new ways to talk about Latinos, because I was just thinking today that anytime you hear the sentence, Latinos in this country, ... or Latinos support this, ... If you, just as a mind experiment, replaced Latinos with whites or blacks, you would say that's preposterous. I mean, this is a ridiculous thing to say or to think. And so I think that will become more the case with Latinos as the population continues to grow.
So thank you, Geraldo Cadava. You want to hold up your book again?
Oh, sure. The Hispanic Republic.
Hispanic Republican, the shaping of an American political identity from Nixon to Trump. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Take care. And thank you all.